Hey SAT students, this guy from penguinprep.com. In this video, I'll teach you the prerequisites for leveling, a strategy that you can use to solve more than 70% of all SAT grammar boundary questions. Let's begin. To use leveling strategies, you need to understand what an independent clause is and what a noun is. An independent clause is a group of words that expresses a complete idea. And for something to express a complete idea, it must have two things. One, a subject. Two, a verb which that subject is actively doing. For example, the penguin hops around Antarctica is an independent clause because there is the subject, the penguin, and there is a verb which the penguin is actively doing, hops. She writes to her husband is an independent clause because there is a subject, she, and there is a verb which she is actively doing, writes. Searching for artifacts in the dark was exciting is an independent clause because there is a subject, searching for artifacts in the dark, and a verb which the subject is actively doing, was. So remember, an independent clause has a subject and a verb which the subject is actively doing. Now, a noun is a set of words that is not an independent clause. For example, the penguin is a noun because there's only a subject, the penguin, and no verb which the penguin is actively doing. Searching for artifacts in the dark is a noun because there's only a subject, searching for artifacts in the dark, and no verb which the subject is actively doing. So, a set of words can either be an independent clause or a noun, and it's incredibly important that you're able to distinguish between them. Here's a problem for you. This is an independent clause because it has a subject, the oven, and a verb which the subject is actively doing, is grilling. Now let's look at more tricky cases. The penguin hops around Antarctica is an independent clause. However, the penguin that hops around Antarctica is not an independent clause. That is, it's a noun. Some of you may ask, why? There's a subject, the penguin, and a verb hops, so this meets the conditions to be an independent clause, no? No. If you remember the precise condition, an independent clause needs to have a subject and a verb which is actively done by that subject. In this example, the word that makes the hops function as a verb that describes the penguin, not a verb which the penguin actively does. So this example is not an independent clause. I know this is confusing, so let's take a look at how we can change this into an independent clause. The penguin that hops around Antarctica fell into a crevice. This is an independent clause because now there's a subject, the penguin, and there is a verb which the penguin is actively doing, fell. The key thing you need to notice here is that there's a difference between the verb hops and the verb fell in the example. Hops is paired with the word that, which makes hops a verb that describes the penguin, not something that the penguin is actively doing. On the other hand, fell is a verb that's isolated from the attributes of the penguin, and it's something that the penguin is actively doing. So fell serves as the verb here. Let's try a similar variation. The penguin hopping around Antarctica. Is this an independent clause or a noun? This is a noun. Like before, hopping is a verb that describes the penguin, not something that the penguin actively does. And because of that, we don't really have a verb that supplements the subject, and so we have a noun. Now let's change this example. The penguin hopping around Antarctica fell into a crevice. Is this an independent clause or a noun? This is an independent clause because now there is a verb which the penguin is actively doing, fell. One important note, a group of words that describe a subject, like hopping around Antarctica or that hop around Antarctica, are called descriptive phrases. You can remove them when evaluating whether something is an independent clause or a noun. So for the example above, you can just look at the penguin fell into a crevice. This way, the problem becomes trivial. Now pause the video and try these yourself. The first example is a noun. Although we have a subject, the penguin, and a verb, hops, this hops is being used to describe the penguin and is not something that the penguin actively does. So it doesn't meet the conditions for an independent clause, and therefore it is a noun. A more simple way to solve this is by recognizing that everything from who to Antarctica is a descriptive phrase. So you can remove that and you're left with the penguin. The penguin is just a lone subject with no verb. So this is a noun. The second example is an independent clause because the subject is the penguin and there is a verb which the penguin is actively doing, fell. For the third example, the descriptive phrase is which hops around Antarctica. If we remove that, we are left with the penguin. The penguin is a lone subject, so this is clearly a noun. For the fourth example, if we remove the descriptive phrase, we are left with the penguin fell into the crevice. The penguin is the subject, and the verb which the penguin does is fell. So this is an independent clause. The second trick case is on subordinating conjunctions. The penguin flies into the garden is an independent clause, but because the penguin flies into the garden is not an independent clause. Words like because, when, unless, until, as, since, while, and although are called subordinating conjunctions. And when they are placed at the beginning of a sentence, it makes something that's an independent clause into a non. Why? Well, an independent clause, if you recall, is something that expresses a complete idea, but placing a subordinating conjunction at the beginning makes the sentence wait for more information. For example, placing when in front of the independent clause, the penguin flies in the garden, makes you wonder what happens when the penguin flies in the garden. So that word when leaves the sentence open-ended, making it no longer complete and hence making it no longer independent. Now pause the video and try these questions yourself. The first example is a noun. The subject is the market volatility, and the verb, which the subject actively does, is had. However, we have a subordinating conjunction although. Remember that a subordinating conjunction will demote what is normally an independent clause into a noun. So this first example becomes a noun. The second example is also a noun. The descriptive phrase is from who all the way to surface. Removing that leaves us with marine biologist SE. This is a lone subject. There's no verb, so this is a noun. The third example is an independent clause. If we remove the descriptive phrase, we are left with marine biologist SE insists that the deep sea remains stubbornly uncharted. Here, the subject is marine biologist SE, and the verb which the subject actively does is insists. So we have an independent clause. Let's try 3 more questions. The first example is an independent clause because the subject is tracks of the abyssal plain and the verb which the subject actively does is however. The second example is also an independent clause. If we remove the descriptive phrase in the middle, then we are left with botanist RWK treats plants as teachers rather than mere specimens. The subject here is going to be botanist RWK and the verb which the subject actively does is treats. The third example is also an independent clause because if we remove the descriptive phrase, we are left with the engineer HL co-patented a frequency hopping system during the war. Here, the subject is the engineer HL and the verb which the subject actively does is co-patented, so we have an independent clause. Great job! That was the first video on leveling strategies. Now that you have the prerequisites covered, you can move on to video 2 where you will learn about the actual steps behind the strategy. Before moving on though, I highly recommend that you go to penguinprep.com and solve the questions uploaded for this lesson. The direct link is in the description below and I've handpicked those questions to maximize your learning. Do that first and I'll see you in lesson 2.